So, I wanted to take a few minutes to discuss the Brett Kavanaugh scandal. Really, no. I really don't. I'd really rather be talking about just about anything else. Septic tanks, bad dye jobs. All right, well, but some of my students have asked me some questions on the subject, and I feel inclined to give my 2 cents. Yeah. Okay, the Kavanaugh nomination, even before all the hooey hit the fan, was determined to be the most significant Supreme Court nomination in recent memory. For many years, the Supreme Court has been a largely conservative body. This has been a huge concern to progressives because the Supreme Court is in a position to completely unravel the tattered remains of the New Deal and the Great Society, as well as some of the advancements that were put in place under President Obama, namely the Dodd-Frank Act regulating finance markets and the Affordable Care Act reforming health care. Most pressing among those concerns is the fate of Roe v. Wade, the 1970s-era Supreme Court decision protecting the right of women to receive an abortion. A conservative court also puts in jeopardy any of a number of progressive goals for the United States, like a single-payer system, publicly financed higher education, a living wage law, and many others. A court too far to the right can, regardless of popular support, kibosh any effort at reform for generations. For years now, the Supreme Court has been the main instrument dismantling progressive initiatives like campaign finance reform, such as the infamous Citizens United decision allowing a flood of corporate cash into the election process, and disempowering unions, as with the recent Janus decision making it illegal for unions to recover fees associated with collective bargaining from non-union members. However, the court has fallen short of some significant conservative goals. Roe remains the law of the land, for instance, and the Affordable Care Act, with some modification, was upheld as constitutional, not to mention the Obergefell case, confirming the right of same-sex couples to marry. One reason for this relatively progressive track record was the presence of Justice Anthony Kennedy. Kennedy was a relatively moderate conservative who was often the swing vote in the increasingly right-wing court. But now Kennedy is retiring, and President Trump, with a Republican Congress, has the opportunity to replace Kennedy with a like-minded moderate conservative. They have the opportunity to do that. They're not going to do that. They've selected Brett Kavanaugh, a very right-wing candidate and legal operative of the Bush administration. Oh my God, oh Jesus. Okay, so here's the thing. When it comes to qualifications, it's hard to make the claim that Kavanaugh isn't qualified. He has a long legal resume, exercising legal counsel and jurisprudence at multiple levels. So there, I said it. He's qualified. On the other hand, there are quite a few people who are just as qualified. Why pick Kavanaugh? From the point of view of the political right, Kavanaugh is a perfect candidate. Despite his ambiguous responses during his Senate hearing, Kavanaugh has a well-established conservative bona fides. It's clear the right expects that he will overturn Roe. This is the crown jewel of the right. For progressives, however, the threat Kavanaugh poses to Roe is just the beginning. Kavanaugh's record on the court shows that he sides with right-wing causes 91% of the time and rules in favor of corporations more than 3/4 of the time. As Rhode Island Senator Sheldon Whitehouse pointed out, on the D.C. Circuit, Kavanaugh showed his readiness to join the Roberts Five with big political wins for the Republican and corporate interests, unleashing special interest money into elections, protecting corporations from liability, helping polluters pollute, striking down common-sense gun regulations, keeping injured plaintiffs out of court, and perhaps most important for the current occupant of the Oval Office, expounding a nearly limitless vision of presidential immunity from the law. That last part is really significant, the presidential immunity. Kavanaugh is on record as having a broad definition of executive privilege, believes that the president should not be burdened with being investigated, even suggesting that the Constitution precludes the option of indicting a sitting president. That's a bit of a sticking point, as the current president of the United States is currently under investigation and subject to multiple legal challenges, from possibly colluding with a foreign power to swing a presidential election, to a lawsuit dealing with illegal campaign allocations resulting from covering up an affair with an actress. Oh my God, I can't do this. Oh man. One very possible outcome of these investigations and lawsuits is the possibility of prosecution. Needless to say, his selection of Kavanaugh, the one guy who believes he should not be investigated, is, well, suspect at best. There's also an issue with his personal integrity. There's some question that, at the very least, Kavanaugh exercised a profound lack of judgment when using what turned out to be stolen Democratic files when he was working for the Bush administration. At worst, he lied to Congress about his participation. These files were stolen in an attempt to help the Bush administration secure seats in the federal courts for his more controversial picks. This was a process that Kavanaugh led the Judiciary Committee in 2006 to believe he had no role in. He had a role in it. So, did he lie to the committee in 2006? So, there are plenty of valid political reasons for progressives to oppose Kavanaugh's nomination. Well, that's the way it goes, bucko. Elections have consequences. Your side lost, so suck it. Well, that's another problem. You see, there's a ghost hovering over this particular nomination. The ghost of Merrick Garland. What? Merrick Garland isn't dead? Okay, there's a ghost hovering over this particular nomination. The ghost of Merrick Garland's chances of being a Supreme Court justice. It doesn't have the same punch. The problem is that Barack Obama won his election. When the time came for him to get his spoils and replace a conservative Justice Antonin Scalia with a fairly milquetoast but eminently qualified centrist, the Republican Party played politics and simply refused to allow Garland a hearing. Their claim was that the American people should have a say in their Supreme Court, so the GOP stalled the nomination until after the election. It worked brilliantly. Mitch McConnell refers to this as his greatest moment. The problem is that now the Democrats have a credible claim to legitimately stall the process of the current nominee until after the midterm elections. Turnabout is fair play, right? Why shouldn't the Democrats use whatever tools at their disposal to delay this GOP-endorsed nominee? Kavanaugh was nominated by a grossly unpopular president, and the Republicans face a hotly contested midterm election, despite huge advantages in the electoral map. Hey, let the people have the say. We can argue that this process shouldn't look this way, that this kind of political grandstanding and subterfuge is not how our government institutions are supposed to work. Frankly, looking at this sociologically, one can't help but see an institution going through not just a crisis, but a total collapse in legitimacy, where norms and values are secondary to bureaucratic maneuvering and political expediency. Really, if this keeps up, it's just a matter of time before our government loses even the tattered vestiges that remain of its authority. This confirmation hearing could be a good time to discuss ways to reestablish legitimate authority in our government, but I don't see that happening anytime soon. It can also be a really good time to debate the role of the Supreme Court in this process. Should the Supreme Court be above the politics that motivates the legislative and executive branches? What kind of Supreme Court do we want? Do we want justices who are going to respond to the currents of political thought in contemporary society? Or justices who are best situated to fulfill the bucket list of whatever party happens to be in power at the time? Should a justice with such little approval, despite the qualifications, be allowed on the court? If such a person is allowed on the court and the court embarks on a profoundly unpopular course, what does that do to the perceived legitimacy of the highest court in the land? We could have been having these discussions. Instead, all hell broke loose. A couple weeks ago, Senator Dianne Feinstein brought what was assumed to be a done deal nomination process to a screeching halt by revealing a letter she received alleging that Brett Kavanaugh had sexually assaulted a 15-year-old girl while at a high school party 35 years ago. The accuser, Dr. Blasey Ford, sent this letter in July, but gave permission to bring the letter into the public awareness just recently. Her claims are buttressed by the fact that she reported this attack to her husband and to a therapist years before the Kavanaugh nomination. She also passed a lie detector test. However, there are some holes in her story. Quite understandably, there are some inconsistencies in her memory of the events from so long ago. She also can't get anyone to corroborate her claims, including a third party who was allegedly in the room at the time of the assault. So this is boiling down to a case of he said, she said, further mystified by years and almost certainly the influence of alcohol. So now we have a whole new set of variables that must be contended with, and for the foremost question on everyone's mind is, who do we believe? Unfortunately, one's answer to this question often says more about one's party affiliation than it does a dedication to the truth and justice. Democrats claim that Blasey Ford would have no alternative reason to bring such a charge, knowing how forcefully she would be attacked by the right. As it stands, Blasey Ford has had to leave her home and faces daily death threats, while the most powerful political entity in the country, the Republican Party, including the President of the United States, denounce and mock her ruthlessly. Liberals suggest that in cases in which women show the courage to come forward and report their victimization, they should be believed. There's some data to support this. First, most sexual assaults, over 60%, go unreported. Of the 40% or so sexual assaults that do get reported, only about 5% are determined to be false reports. According to the National Sexual Violence Research Center, research into false reporting reveals that such reports constitute as little as 2% of all reports, but no more than 10%. So with nothing else to go on, believing the victim is a good idea more than 90% of the time. Sandra Newman, writing for Court, states that in many cases, false accusations are made by teenage girls who may be trying to get out of trouble or sometimes to get medical care or psychiatric drugs. Newman notes that almost half of all false rape charges are lodged not by the victims, but by someone else, usually a parent. Also, according to Newman, almost invariably, adult false accusers who persist in pursuing charges have a previous history of bizarre fabrications or criminal fraud. As it stands, Dr. Blasey Ford does not fit either of these descriptions, so this narrows the odds even further. That being said, conservatives do have a point when they say there's just not enough proof. False accusations do get lodged, and sometimes victims may even be mistaken. It's a teenage party. Alcohol was almost certainly involved. There's just no telling what really happened without concrete evidence. For this reason, we have to presume Judge Kavanaugh to be innocent until he's proven guilty. Well, that is a good point. There really isn't enough evidence to prove Kavanaugh guilty in a court of law. But a Senate confirmation hearing is not a court of law. A Senate confirmation hearing is most analogous to a job interview. The burden of proof is not so high for a job interview as it is a trial. The Senate Judiciary Committee is not going to determine Kavanaugh's guilt or innocence. That's not the function of this particular institution. So if we're not going to determine guilt or innocence, what is the question? In fact, the question has never changed, regardless of the clickbait scandals, frantic reporting, and ADHD news cycles. The question is Brett Kavanaugh someone we want on the Supreme Court? This points to the previous questions about Kavanaugh's politics. This judge has views that are not consistent with the majority of Americans. This is especially true of Roe v. Wade. According to an NBC Wall Street Journal poll, fewer than 25% of Americans want to see Roe overturned. This confirms an earlier poll conducted by Pew. In 1987, Ronald Reagan nominated Judge Robert Bork to replace Justice Lewis Powell. But Bork held many controversial opinions about civil rights, family planning, abortion, and other topics that were not in line with average Americans. He lost the confirmation in a controversial Senate vote. Many observers suggest that the Bork fiasco changed the way Supreme Court nominations are made and conducted. Some, especially on the right, believe that Judge Kavanaugh is being borked, which can't be a good thing. Nobody wants to be borked under any circumstances. Still, Americans did vote for Republicans, knowing full well overturning Roe was on their agenda and knowing full well that the Supreme Court is chock full of octogenarians. Well, actually, not quite. Among those who did vote, most of them voted Democratic during the presidential election. And the way districts are gerrymandered and the electoral maps during any given election, there's a distinct advantage for Republicans despite the prospects of losing the majority vote. Majority rule is just not something we can rely on anymore. Kavanaugh's record, unpopularity, does not preclude a confirmation. That being said, Supreme Court justice is not an elected position. That's true, but it is an important symbolic position. Sociologists who analyze government often point to Max Weber's descriptions of legitimate authority. What gives a government the authority to govern? According to Weber, people accept the authority of a government based on that government's perceived legitimacy. Think about it. Why do we do what our government tells us to do, even if we don't want to do it? For the most part, we do it. It's not entirely because we're forced. According to Weber, it's because we perceive the government as having the legitimate authority to make the rules, even to use force. Well, what happens when we no longer see the government as a legitimate authority? How much of our political debate today has to do with the fact that our government is losing legitimacy to govern? This is an open question, but certainly one that should be addressed. There are quite a few analysts out there who suggest that the fact that we elected a pedantic, narcissistic orange man-baby with delusions of grandeur tempered only in acute paranoia as President of the United States is an indicator that Americans are losing faith in our governing institutions and norms. Nationalism is becoming the dominant voice in conservative circles, with democratic socialism on the left establishing a place at the political table. People are looking for alternatives. How does a hyper-partisan Supreme Court nominee impact this political insecurity? And on top of that, the perception. The perception, mind you, that the main reason Kavanaugh was selected is because of his position on presidential immunity. I emphasize perception because it's our perceptions of the government as a legitimate authority that makes the system work. So these are reasons for opposing the Kavanaugh nomination that have nothing to do with sexual assault. Of course, conservatives can claim that liberals will never be satisfied with any nominees selected by the right. Well, to a certain extent, that's true. If you care about politics, of course, you're going to oppose people with whom you disagree politically. But that's different from rejecting their legitimacy to govern. Liberals were vehemently opposed to Trump's first Supreme Court nomination, Neil Gorsuch, another very partisan figure. But the question of his legitimacy as a candidate was never really an issue, despite the fact that he was to occupy a seat that was, according to most liberals and Democrats, stolen from Obama. This isn't the case with Kavanaugh. Now he had sexual assault allegations to the mix. Remember back in 1987 when Ronald Reagan's second nominee to replace Supreme Court Justice Lewis Powell, Judge Douglas Ginsburg, had to step down from the nomination when it came out that he smoked a little pot in the 60s? Ah, the halcyon days of yore. But now that we have the issue of sexual assault resulting in the dredging up of other embarrassing and questionable elements of Judge Kavanaugh's youth, in 2015 Kavanaugh said, "We had a good saying that we've held firm to this day, which is, what happens at Georgetown Prep stays at Georgetown Prep. I think that's been a good thing for all of us." In this context, that doesn't sound so cute and funny anymore. Then we have the issue with Renate alumni, in which Kavanaugh and his friends seem to be boasting about their sexual encounters with a female classmate. These accusations remain and build upon each other. Do they impact Judge Kavanaugh's credibility as a sitting judge with a lifetime appointment to the highest court in the country? Furthermore, should they? After all, none of the allegations have been proven, and the other issues may be perfectly innocent expressions taken out of context. Can we deny a qualified candidate an opportunity to advance based on allegations that have not been substantiated? Also, the alleged incidents happened when he was young, over 35 years ago. Should a person who has been an upright citizen for 35 years be held accountable for events that took place when he was a teenager? Do you want to be held accountable for the things you did when you were a teenager? Do you? Do you? Well, of course not. But Kavanaugh isn't applying for a job at Walmart. He's looking to take a seat on the Supreme Court of the United States. This isn't just a job. It's a symbolic position of significant importance. It's not just about qualifications. It's about what this individual represents. Currently, we're in the midst of a great debate brought to the fore by the Me Too movement. We're renegotiating the norms, roles, and expectations guiding men's interactions with women. This is a normal, healthy process for society. As women gain power and equity in society, they will push a more feminine narrative of American culture. This narrative can be a powerful source of social evolution and a great benefit to men who, upon letting go of their patriarchal privileges, will benefit from sharing more meaningful relationships with women. This renegotiation is taking place without regard to the Supreme Court, but the court, as such a symbolic structure, will contribute to this narrative. 17-year-old Tori Siegel said to the Washington Post, "I don't know anyone who's a girl my age who hasn't been sexually harassed. That's our reality, and I feel like politicians are completely ignoring it." In the New York Times, forgive me if I mispronounce his name, 17-year-old Macy Wisharek reminds us that, for me and my friends, his past is our now. She's concerned that the boys will be boys' defense of Kavanaugh and his possible ascension to the bench will negatively impact young girls. Boys will learn that what you do in high school won't affect your future at all, so go do the damage you need to do now. So, it's not enough to focus on qualifications. We have to consider what a Kavanaugh appointment would mean symbolically in our current debate on the objectification of women. For instance, if any progress is to be made in women's lives, we must address the factors that stop the victims of sexual assault from coming forward against their abusers. Again, only 40% of sexual assault victims would come forward and report their attackers. How much progress could be made if men knew that they were going to be reported for attacking women? What does the potential appointment of Judge Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court do to that prospect? Finally, as it stands, there are 3 accusers facing Kavanaugh. Just a couple of weeks ago, nobody would have predicted that Judge Kavanaugh might have committed sexual assault or had a disturbing history with women. Now he's defending himself in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee over one accusation with other possible accusations being made and a closer look and scrutiny at his history with regard to how he perceives and interacts with women. The third accuser states that Kavanaugh participated in many objectifying activities at drunken parties in his youth. What else might come out? It's one thing when accusations are made against a nominee. What happens when the accusations are lodged against a sitting Supreme Court justice? Look, I don't know if Kavanaugh is guilty or innocent. I may never know, and neither will you, regardless of your political affiliation. You may think you know the truth, but you don't. Your understanding is being shaped by your politics. We should be honest with ourselves about that. However, I don't think our governing institutions can sustain too many shocks against its legitimacy anymore. I have no delusions that if Kavanaugh should step down, he wouldn't be replaced with another nominee just as ruthlessly conservative. But he should step down, and we should move on to a different nominee.